Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, Phenomenology of Perception. We are at video 5, and this is the fourth part of the introduction, the last part of the introduction, the phenomenal field. Right, so first of all, Merleau-Ponty returns to the question of what sensing is. What is sensation? What does it mean to say that a thing has a certain sense? And the example he gives is quite good, I think, for this. He talks about a child touching a flame and getting burnt. And then for that child, the flame becomes repulsive, becomes invested with this sense of being repulsive. What does it mean? How can we explain that? How can we understand that? That's the question really driving this whole introduction. We've looked at a couple of different, basically in the introduction we've just rejected a number of different ideas. Rejected the idea that it's sensing is just pure impression, that it's qualities out there in the world. We looked at associationism and the projection of memories. What else do I have here? Attention, judgment. So none of these ideas that have been kind of put forward by other people really capture what sensation is for Merleau-Ponty. And finally, he talks about qualia. So qualia being the internal kind of subjective component of sensory perceptions, the felt experience, or the felt experience as this particular internal kind of idea, a feeling, a felt idea. So could sensing just be qualia? Could it just be the arising of qualia in the mind? And he rejects this idea as well. Sensing can't be qualia because, he says, we don't perceive pure qualia. There is no, it's not a pure internal felt experience. And again, the idea is that if we lock ourselves in our minds, if we lock ourselves away from the external world, we're not going to be able to do justice to genuine sensation, to what it means to perceive. We're not going to be able to fully account for that. If we were perceiving just pure qualia, for that to be true, it would have to be the case that the world was just a spectacle for us, laid out before us, and our bodies just mechanisms for these impartial minds to survey the world around it. And like I say, this is the opposite of what Merleau-Ponty's getting at, and it just doesn't capture what we think of or what we experience in sensation. It's not this experience that is kind of detached from an external world, which we are just spectators to. And that's what the idea of qualia is. It's this idea that it's just happening internally. It's all happening within the mind, and that's not what Merleau-Ponty's about. Rather, he says, so if that's not going to do justice to sensing, what will do justice to this idea? Sensing, he says, invests a quality with a living value. And it means that this quality has signification for us as a body. So there's already this connection to the world through the body. It's not just, we're not just this disinterested impartial spectator. We're in the world. We're thrust into the middle of the world through our bodies. The flame has a sense because I have a body that can be burnt by it. It's not just all happening in my mind. It's not just, I'm not perceiving pure mental qualia, pure mental experiences. It's more inclusive than that. And that's what it means to sense something. It means we're investing a quality with a living value. You can't avoid the body when you're discussing sensing. But that's precisely what the talk of Qualia does. It ignores the body, it ignores the external world. What's really important is what's going on up here. But that's not how this works. That again, it just doesn't do justice to what sensing is, what sensation is. So the body obviously is going to be important for us, and I found I don't think it's not like an official definition, but I managed to extract this idea from the book. Sensing is this living communication with the world that makes it present to us as the familiar place of our life. Now, I like that definition, and not just because it's, the reason I like it is because it seems to capture the idea of sensing. It seems to capture the idea of what sensation is. It's not an overly intellectualized, abstracted notion. It doesn't lock us within our own heads. It doesn't reduce sensing to it doesn't reduce me to a passive spectator who's being kind of bombarded by sensory impressions and they're just leaving a mark on me. But I'm not completely dominating the scene before me either. I'm not choosing how to interpret everything. There's this give and take. I'm in the world. I'm in the middle of it. It's a living communication, and it makes the world present to us as a familiar place, the place of our life. I mean, it just seems to capture the essence of the word sensing there in a way that none of the other explanations that we've looked at really do. And there's also, if you're familiar with Heidegger, that also sounds very Heideggerian there, that the world is a familiar place for us. Heidegger talks about dwelling with. I think he even uses the word familiarity. Obviously, it's an English translation, but he talks about being at home in the world. It's a familiar place for us. And again, you just can't get that if you go the idealist route and treat us as constituting subjects, or if you go the empiricist route and treat us as like passive recipients of these sensory impressions. So that's cool. That's a nice kind of wrap up of that section and gets us to an understanding or a definition of what sensing is. So he talks about science a little bit more and just says what science does. Science objectifies phenomena. So it's doing the opposite here. It deals with theoretical ideal bodies and forces. Again, we're not immersed in the world of science. We're not immersed in the scientific world. In the scientific world, it's all objective. A thing is a thing independent from me. There's no sense of this living communication that Merleau-Ponty talks about. In fact, he says it provides an inert milieu of experience. And that's a great phrase, right? It's this inert, independent realm of stuff out there, separate from me, and which I can know and measure and quantify and analyze and make theories about, but it's it's out there. It's different from me, and I'm a disinterested spectator. I'm interested only to the extent that there's instrumental value in the things there, or that in the sense that I have some kind of pure appreciation of the thing, as opposed to, again, a living communication. I love that expression. It's another interesting thing he says that reminds us of Heidegger. He says science presupposes being, and because we perceive we already understand being, there's no need to investigate it. And that Heidegger also says in Being and Time that the question of being has been passed over, has been overlooked throughout most of the history of philosophy, and certainly of the history of science. Science can only operate by delimiting, by outlining a sphere of inquiry, and that sphere of inquiry is the physical world, being. But in doing that, in presupposing that, then we can't ask this deeper question. We can't penetrate to the phenomena, to what the thing is for a lived, engaged participant, a lived, engaged experiencer in the world. So we're just reopening that question. We're reopening this question, or perhaps opening it for the first time even, asking the question, what is being? We're drilling down on really things that seem quite mundane. Perception. Merleau-Ponty wrote a whole book about perception. What's there to know, right? You could ask that question quite legitimately, but that's the point. This idea has been passed over. It's been ignored. Sensation. What is sensing? We know that. But do we know that? That's the point. That's the question. This stuff is all, it's rich with ideas that haven't been asked because the subject matter has been presumed to be known. It's been presumed that we know everything there is to know, or that there is nothing more to know. There's nothing interesting to know about this. So that's that's the goal. That's what we're all about here. Science also reduces the living body. So talking about the body, it reduces the living body to a machine. It's just a thing in the world. It's behavior then is now something which is analyzed from a third person perspective. And this is, again, obviously in a time when behaviorism was in ascendance. So cognitive psychology was unfavored. And so behavior was treated as third person. What you could see a stimulus and then a behavior following from that stimulus. And that's all that there was to know. That was the idea. So Merleau-Ponty is obviously reacting against that. It's this type of framework, this type of thinking is governed by causality, and you're left with the body as a thing without an interior. And that was just kind of the behaviorist mantra, right? Forget about conscious experience, whatever that is. We can analyze. We can get a hold of behavior, stimulus and behavior. That's enough for us to understand the human being. Not so. So the living body then is no longer my body. It's just the visible expression of a concrete ego. And it's the same then with the other's body. The other's body is exactly the same. It's just a machine. Stimulus in, behavior out. That's all there is to know. We want more than that. We want to get more information. I mean, that's that's a kind of a criticism that's less appropriate today, perhaps. Although, I mean, in terms of psychological, in terms of psychology, it's probably less appropriate, less applicable, because cognitive psychology has risen to the fore. But the scientific approach still, there's still this strong determinist attitude towards human beings. We're nothing, we're just another causal link in the chain. Everything's dominated by billiard balls bouncing around in your, even if it's in your head. It's still just cause and effect all the way back to the Big Bang. And that, I mean, if that's not a kind of classical behaviorist understanding of the human being, I don't know what is. So perhaps it's not so inapplicable to us today. But in the sphere of psychology anyway, I think it's probably questionable. So another consequence of this way of thinking about the human being is that everything's reduced to pleasure and pain. It's all just stimulus. If it produces a positive feeling, you'll go for more of it. If you get a negative feeling, you'll resist, you'll stop, you'll try and get rid of it in some way. So sensation is now a passive thing. It's something that happens to us. It's something that prods us into doing something. It elicits behavior from us. And that, again, just doesn't align with what we think about when we think of sensing and perception. It just doesn't account for what we kind of intuitively understand about sensing, what we mean when we say we sense something, or something appears with a certain sense for us. So the result of this whole scientific outlook is we have a body, which is an exterior without an interior, and we have a subjectivity, which is an interior without an exterior. This is the impartial spectator, or the transcendental subject. And so essentially Merleau-Ponty is going to be reacting against those ideas for the rest of the book. Now the initial goal is to return to the lived world of phenomena beneath this objective world. So return to the pre-objective world. And Merleau-Ponty calls this the phenomenal field. And we've talked about this a little bit before, but just briefly, this is the layer of experience in which things are first given to us, in which a figure first appears as a figure. This is happening at this level of the phenomenal world, beneath the objective world. So this is not an objective account of, or it's not an objective or scientific account of bits out there external to us. It's a deeper understanding of how those bits appear for us as bits in the first place. The layer of experience in which things first appear for us. And Merleau-Ponty calls this the system self, others, things. And that's what, I mean, that's pretty much everything is encapsulated in that, right? Self, others, and things, the external world. So that's what this phenomenal field deals with. It's not an inner world or introspection. So he's clear. He wants to be clear about that. It's not about retreating to some kind of internal experience only accessible by the individual. Something therefore inexpressible. Something that can't be expressed to others or even to the self, because it's something you can only experience. You can't express it. That's not what Merleau-Ponty's getting at. This is not some kind of ineffable, mystical description of reality. This is just how we perceive. It's how we fundamentally experience things. And an interesting thing he talks about here regarding the phenomenal field is, he says it's the nature of perception. And basically that's what the phenomenal field is. It's perception. Perception takes place at this level of what Merleau-Ponty is calling the phenomenal field. So it's the nature of perception to hide itself from itself. And that strikes me as an interesting and important idea. And this is the reason perception hides itself from itself, and that's why it's so difficult to see. It's why it's so difficult to uncover what's actually going on in perception, because it naturally hides itself from itself. Why? Because this is the only way that things can appear as things. And I thought of an example which I think captures this idea quite nicely. If you think about a movie, watching a movie, when you watch a movie, everything fits together nicely. Every scene is in its correct place. You can follow the story from beginning to middle to end, and at the end you have an understanding of all of the events that make up the story. But if you were to watch the making of the movie, if you were to actually watch how every scene was filmed, you'd see the actors and the actresses, and they're taking breaks to get makeup redone, and they're shooting scenes out of order, and you're looking at the director and the crew and the people recording, and you're looking at all of this stuff. You would have no idea about the story. You wouldn't understand what's going on. It would be very difficult to piece together the story if that was your experience, if you saw how the movie was made. It's the same idea with perception. If you saw how perception was carried out, you would no longer perceive things anymore, or you'd have to work, you'd have to fight to try and understand what things were, because you're not seeing the things, you're seeing how the things are constructed. You're not seeing the movie, you're seeing how the movie is made. And so perception must, if it is to work, conceal itself from the perceiver. And that is a crucial insight that comes straight from Heidegger and on the essence of truth. And I've talked about this in a video. I did a video on this where he says that, or he realizes, I think this is post-being in time, that being is concealed in order to reveal beings. That's how Heidegger expresses it, and that it must be concealed. It's not just that it's not a contingent feature of being, that it's kind of hidden or not apparent to us. It's an essential feature of being, and that's the same thing that Merleau-Ponty is saying here, just using the word perception. It's essential that perception hide itself from itself. We can't see how figures appear for us as figures on a background with a sense. We can't see that explicitly, or else we wouldn't see the figures anymore. Okay, I think you've got the idea of that. But that's just such a really important point that I really wanted to drill at home. And basically, the goal here in uncovering this phenomenal field is to make explicit the pre-scientific life of consciousness. So after reaching the phenomenal field, that's not the end though. We will continue on to something Merleau-Ponty calls the Transcendental Field. And he even calls this a second reduction. So you can think about the transition to the phenomenal field as like a first reduction, and then the second reduction takes us to this transcendental field. And so what this is we're going to take that phenomenal field, self, others, things, take that as an object of analysis. So we're going to piece or look to understand that whole field itself. So this is moving then from the created to the creating, from the constituted to the constituting. So the phenomenal field was kind of a focus on things, the self, the other, the external world. And now we're directing our attention to those things, to how those, how our perception of those things is structured. The way I think of this is kind of like the framework of the phenomenal field. Now, I should note that I don't think that there's an infinite regress here. So there's no danger that we're going to keep moving backwards. Go from kind of the scientific world to this pre-objective phenomenal world. Then there's a transcendental field, and perhaps an unlimited number of fields beyond that. I don't think there's a danger of that, because we're not moving, we're not regressing back to kind of an earlier realm. All that we're doing is taking this phenomenal field, perception, the way that figures appear as figures, and subjecting that to an analysis. How does perception work? The phenomenal field analyzes the things, looks at the things, looks at the self, looks at the other. The transcendental field looks at the phenomenal field itself. How does that work? How is, again, like I said, the framework? What's the structure of this phenomenal field? How is all of this? How does all of this tie together? And we'll see that temporality plays a fairly large role in this too. So Merleau-Ponty does stress here that we're not moving to a universal subject. So this is not going to be some kind of regress to that. Reflection, he says, never has the world spread out before it. It's never completely open to us. It's never open to our gaze. It's always a partial view, a kind of a limited. We have limited power in these fields, and that's why we call them. That's why Merleau-Ponty calls them fields: phenomenal field, transcendental field. It's not. There's a boundary. These are bounded ideas. They're limited in scope. So we're never dealing with this completely transcendent, absolutely radically free subject constituting consciousness. That's not where Merleau-Ponty sees this whole project culminating. And a good example of that, actually, that he points out is the way that we always see the sun rise and set, even though we know that that's not what's happening. We know that that's not what is actually going on. The sun isn't moving across the sky. It's not rising, traveling across the sky and then setting on the opposite horizon. That's the way we see it, even though we know that that's not the truth. And that's because these fields that we're talking about, our experience, our perception is limited. It's not, there's no way to step out of this and experience, again, the world as it really is. A phrase that I just don't think means anything. So there's that. Was there anything else I wanted to say there? Can't think of it. Okay, let me just keep going. So the goal ultimately here is to become conscious of ourselves at the same time we become conscious of our results. Cool. And I was thinking about these reductions, and I really wanted to map them onto Husserl's reductions. And I think it's probably fair to say that the phenomenal field is what, as at least what I understand the eidetic reduction to be, a reduction to the essences of things. So looking at the essence of what the self is, what the other is, what things, the external world is. And then the transcendental field is the transcendental reduction. So the reduction to how those things are constituted by a living perspective, by a lived subject. My brain is starting to fry. I better wrap this up as quick as I can. There's one more thing I wanted to talk about in this video. And so this has come up a couple of times already in the comments. So I really wanted to clarify, and I tried to clarify, I think, in the second or third video. I'm not sure I did a good job. So this idea of idealism that Merleau-Ponty talks about. And when we think of idealism, or when I think of idealism these days, I tend to contrast it with realism. So then the idea would be that idealism is, and so what we're talking about with idealism and realism is basically the nature of reality. What is reality fundamentally? And idealism says that it's mental in some way, or at least mentally constituted. Reality has this kind of mind connotation. Realism says that there is an external reality, independent of our minds, independent of our thinking, thought. So that understanding of idealism and realism, I suspect, is probably dominant these days. And really, it's a metaphysical question, right? It's asking the fundamental nature of reality. What is real? Is it mental stuff, whatever that might be? Is it thoughts? Is it ideas? Or is it some kind of external matter, or, I don't know, energy? E equals mc squared energy, not new agey mystical energy, but or maybe that is it. I don't know. That's what this idea, idealism and realism, is about. Now, that's not what Merleau-Ponty is talking about. So when I use the word idealism, I'm talking about it the way that Merleau-Ponty uses it. And there's a couple of clues that tell us that Merleau-Ponty is not talking about this metaphysical fundamental nature of reality. The first is the way that he also calls idealism intellectualism. So that is not, doesn't sound to me like a metaphysical thesis. And also the second clue is that Merleau-Ponty contrasts idealism with empiricism, not with realism. So now, with that kind of distinction made, idealism and empiricism, we're talking about experience. We're talking about our knowledge, our understanding of reality, not what it's fundamentally made up of. And so the empiricist attitude then says that experience is purely passive. It's something that happens to us. The external world impresses itself on us through sensory impressions. And then we, I see a cat because light waves bounce off that cat at a particular, with a particular wavelength, and that those particles or the wave or whatever it is impacts my retina in a particular way and lights up certain rods and cones and blah, blah, blah. So it's all very passive. It's all mechanical. And that's how I know reality. It's not about what reality is. It's about how I understand, how I can come to know reality. The other side of that coin then is that the idealism, which is to say that experience is purely active. So it's something which is constituted by this kind of transcendent free consciousness imposing itself on sensory givens, on a world that's out there. So both of those, again, are about our access to reality, not about reality itself. And by the way, the empiricist idea, or the empiricist position, doesn't say that there's no consciousness, or that consciousness is an illusion or anything like that. It just says that conscious experience is something that happens to the experiencer. It's kind of coming this way. It's coming from the external to the internal, rather than the other way. And that's the same thing holds with idealism. Idealism doesn't say there's no external world. It says my experience of the world is coming from internal to the external. I'm determining what's out there, and within reason, but that's where things only have value to me. Things only have the value that I give them, and so that's a very Sartrean position. But both of those positions, Merleau-Ponty wants to disagree with. And the important thing for us here, and what I'm talking about, these are not metaphysical questions. These are not grand claims about the fundamental nature of reality. So I just wanted to clarify that first. And the last thing I'm going to talk about are two final criticisms that Merleau-Ponty makes. The first, he finds fault with critical or reflective philosophy, and the paradigmatic example he gives is Kant. And the problem with this this approach is that it moves to the transcendental field, the constitute that how self, others, things are constituted. So it looks at that, but then it goes through that, it goes past that, and finds itself with a universal subject, an absolute mind, a transcendental I in which all individual myselves participate. So that's it doesn't stop with this transcendental field. It continues on and gets to this deeper mind which we're all a part of in some way. And this then I think is a little bit different from the question of idealism or intellectualism I was just talking about, because that seems to take again the individual experiencer as determining reality or access to reality coming from within. This idea of critical or reflective philosophy culminating in a universal subject is kind of a little bit more metaphysical in nature. It gets the point here is that the final stop is not myself as a conscious experiencer. The final stop is beneath me in some absolute mind which we're all participating in. And he says that this is why Kant never considers the other. The other's not a problem for Kant, because in a sense the other is an illusion. Actually, the other is me. I am the other. We're all, it's all just one universal mind. And so he fails to consider the question of who, because again, that question is not fundamental anymore. It's not where Kant will stop. He'll stop at this deeper level where we're all the same. So I've got a quote which I want to read just to clarify some of this a bit. The center of philosophy is no longer an autonomous transcendental subjectivity situated everywhere and nowhere, but is rather found in the perpetual beginning of reflection at that point when an individual life begins to reflect upon itself. Reflection is only truly reflection if it does not carry itself outside of itself, if it knows itself as reflection upon and unreflected, and consequently as a change in the structure of our existence. So there are three things I wanted to point out in this. The first is the center of philosophy is not this transcendental subjectivity, a universal mind, absolute mind, some kind of grand consciousness that we're all participating in. That's not philosophy's task. That's a task for metaphysics or religion or mysticism, right? If you want to go to that level, you're no longer in the realm of legitimate philosophy, according to Merleau-Ponty. And I agree with that. If it's just so speculative, isn't it? It's just, if you really believe that there is this absolute mind which we're all just participating in, what possible evidence could anybody produce to show you that that's not true? There isn't, because any evidence is going to be restricted to the level of the individual myselfs, right? Which is where we are. You'll always have that deeper layer to go to, and that's fine. I mean, you can theorize, you can speculate, but it's not philosophy for Merleau-Ponty. So that was the first point. The second point was philosophy rather is found in the perpetual beginning of reflection when an individual life begins to reflect upon itself. That's where we are at that level of the transcendental field. We're still personalized, it's still individual, but that's where philosophy, that's the realm of philosophy. Anything beyond that is speculation. And the other thing, reflection is only truly reflection if it does not carry itself outside of itself. If you're not, once you start reflecting on something that is external to you, outside of your experience, outside of your domain of experience, it's no longer reflection. I think that's what Merleau-Ponty's saying here. Perhaps it's something else. Perhaps it's speculation. Perhaps it's metaphysics. Whatever you want. Perhaps it's religion. But it's not legitimate philosophy. And philosophy for Merleau-Ponty means phenomenology. So again, tying everything into this individual lived experience, a living communication with the world. That's we don't want to, Merleau-Ponty doesn't want to take us anywhere beyond that. Because, like he says, then the other then diminishes in importance, because they're not really other. Really, they're me. If we're at this level of a transcendental I, and we're just not dealing anymore with genuine human experience, and that's what existentialism is. The exist in existentialism doesn't mean what exists in reality. It means the existence of an individual human being. That's what drives existentialism. So to that extent, the center of philosophy should be this individual life reflecting upon itself. Oh man, I'm almost there. I've got to just hold it together for a couple more minutes. And he also says that critical or reflective philosophy, what it ends up doing is absorbing the object. So it's you've kind of got this transcendental I. It's too powerful. We don't have a legitimate other out there. There is no legitimate external world because it's all me, and so we lose this other, which we saw was a fundamental part of sensing, perception. If you get rid of that, it's hard to see how you can really make sense of human experience, human perception, human sensation. And the other thing that he criticizes here, just in the final part of the introduction, is introspective or intuitive philosophy. And the example he gives for this is Henry Bergson. And he just says here that this type of philosophy seeks a coincidence or merging of the subject and the object. So rather than kind of dominating the other so that we lose any sense of there is no other, this acknowledges that there is another, but it seeks some kind of communion, some merging with the other, in which, again, as we saw with critical philosophy, the other disappears in effect. There is no longer a subject and an object. There's just this kind of merged coincidence of the two. And again, that fails to, then you lose the object for a subject, and you lose any kind of real account, I think, of human perception. Okay, let me stop there. Wow, I don't know why that was so hard. Okay, summary. Let's do a summary. Luckily, the summary is pretty short. So we looked at sensation, and it's defined it as a living communication which makes the world familiar. Nice. I like that. I like that definition. And we also saw that the body was going to be critical to this. It's going to be important, not as kind of an instrument through which we experience the world, and not just this receiving, a stimulus receiving device, but it's going to have a more central role in human experience. Then the other really important point was the double reduction. We looked at the phenomenal field, which was the system, self, others, things, and discussing perception, or the phenomenal field is perception. And the important point I wanted to emphasize there was that it must hide itself from itself. And the other thing was this transcendental field. So this was the second reduction. And basically it's the phenomenon of the phenomenon. Looking at the structure of that phenomenal field, analyzing that system, self, others, things. Okay, I didn't bother with all the idealist, realist, empiricist summary because that's kind of I was just kind of going off on a slight tangent, but I think it's important to orient us before we get into the central ideas of Merleau-Ponty's. And again, like if you those, to the extent that those questions are important to you, those metaphysical questions, I would caution against looking into Merleau-Ponty for answers to those, because I don't think there are any. I don't think he's interested in the fundamental nature of reality, and to kind of try and see him or glean some understanding of a metaphysical reality from Merleau-Ponty or from Sartre or from Heidegger or any of these characters. I think at best you'll misinterpret them, and at worst you won't understand the ideas that they're talking about, because you're driving at something deeper which they're not concerned with. This existentialism, phenomenology, it really, the buck stops at human conscious experience. And yeah, I mean, that's just my impression of these thinkers and the way I think one should approach them. So anyway, thanks for listening. This was, I hope it wasn't as hard for you as it was for me. I don't know why today is, maybe I need more sleep. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.